Today we're going to talk about the end of World War One and some of the main issues dealing with the home front and sort of why the war sort of ended. All right, so pay close attention. So when we talk about World War One, the Central Powers we know were defeated. All right. Now there was a major German attack at first that was on Ludendorff. So Germany is in this attack mode, trying to stop any advance on the Western Front by the Allies. All right. And it was his last desperate attempt to win the war before the U.S. is going to have any major significance, as with sending troops, all right, or supplies. So Germany knew that once the U.S. soldiers arrived, that it sort of would turn the tide of the war. So they tried to hurry up and launch this mass offensive to sort of combat that. All right. So of course Germany's going to put all their resources and troops from the east front, now that Russia's out of the war, to the west. All right, because remember last time we talked about the U.S. is going to enter the war and Russia sort of is going to withdraw from the war. All right. Now, Allies did manage to hold on and they did launch a counteroffensive. All right. Now, with this counteroffensive, Germans slowly were forced back. All right. And Germany was not invaded yet. All right. But in order to save Germany from being invaded, Ludendorff, all right, who was the general, was convinced that they would be defeated if Germany was invaded. He insisted that the German government asked the U.S. for an armistice or a ceasefire. All right. Now, like I said, he's going to hopefully save Germany from invasion and preserve the army's discipline and reputation. So the armistice was finally signed on 11 November. All right. So why did Germany fail? All right. Well, one of the reasons, I mean, there are several reasons sort of why Germany fell. You know, their allies, the Turks, had been decisively defeated by the British forces in the Middle East. All right. So that's one of the uh, countries that were out of the war. The Austria also had been defeated in another major battle on the Italian front. All right. And this continual drain of the campaigns in Russia, it could not really offer any more support or involvement in the war. All right. And Greece is going to actually join the Allied forces. All right. And they began to advance sort of through the Balkans. And then, of course, the U-boats had been overcome by superior tactics on the war at sea. All right. So they protected Allied shipping by convoys. Remember we talked about convoys in the last lecture. All right. Now, the Allied naval blockade, that was very important. All right. With the food shortages and supplies could not get to German lines. All right, it led to German discontent in the German cities, not just the military, but you got to think about the people also. All right, and there were fears, constant fears that the people would sort of revolt against the government because, hey, what's more important, to eat, food, resources, or fighting this war? And if people are starving, well, your basic needs have to sort of be met, and people will begin to revolt. So that was another fear with this whole Allied naval blockade. All right, and of course, you can't discount the arrival of the American troops and the equipment. All right, and also the credit that the U.S. provided for the Allies to purchase supplies. All right, Germans could not match that. All right, their allies were sort of weak, and they could not sort of match the manpower and production. So also, finally, the German High Command, the military and generals in charge, all right, they finally broke and they handed over power to the civilian parliament. All right. So now the people are sort of going to try to make the decisions about what's going to go on in the war, and they advised that the war could not be won. All right. So once again, Woodrow Wilson's going to offer these peace terms, and it was a way out for Germany. All right, because they really were, as you see here, they were isolated by the defeat of its allies. All right. So the Central Powers in general. I mean, let's recap everything and sort of what caused them to lose. Well, we know we've been talking about the Schlieffen Plan, which failed and removed all hopes of a quick German victory. Because remember, they were fighting a war on two fronts. All right. Then the war at sea, this Allied sea power, was decisive. All right. The blockades and the desperate food shortages. All right. made sure that the Allied armies were fully supplied. So the Allies had their supplies and were fully supplied. However, the Central Powers not so much. The submarine campaign failed when the convoys protected by the British campaign brought the U.S. into the war. Of course, we've already talked about the U.S. brought vast new resources, and there were a continuous strain of the heavy losses and loss of the best troops in 1918. All right. Germany constantly had to help out her allies. That's a key point. All right. The Austrians and Bulgarians. The British and Serbian defeat of Bulgaria in September 1918 was the final straw for many Germans who finally knew that there was no chance of victory because Germany couldn't focus on the Western Front because of the fact that it was sort of having to use its resources and troops and armies to sort of defend on the Eastern Front. So Austria was defeated by Italy and Turkey surrendered to help close the war. So we have food shortages, military defeat, all right, mutiny in the Navy, destruction of morale in the Army, and revolution at home. It's just caused all the Central Powers to sort of collapse and forced Germany to sign the ceasefire. All right. So when we talk about the end of the war, we also need to talk about what impact the war had on the home front. All right, to civilians and people living in the respective countries around the world. All right. So one of the main things we're going to see, there was a huge demand for weapons. All right. That meant that in this industry, creating new weapons and supplying these weapons was vital. So men were called to duty. Of course, who's going to fill the void or the vacuum when we were women? All right. Before, women generally you would see worked in the textile industry and in agriculture. Now women were working in engineering, arms manufacturing, and also, to some extent, transport to new development. All right. For example, in Britain, women were urged to join the land army. All right. Basically, they were drafted to sort of work in agriculture, work in the fields, something that was generally reserved for men. All right. Now, women were in uniform in Britain. Women were in the Army and Navy, though they were not combatant. It means they did not fight. And then Russia even took attempts to form a women's battalion in 1917. Now, one thing is key importance here. The work women did in the war was a strong impetus towards greater women's political rights and the right to vote in several countries. All right. Here's the recruitment poster. All right, the National Service Women's Land Army. This was the British recruitment poster urging women to join the Women's Land Army. All right, as you can see here. So also, when we talk about this, talk about propaganda that's sort of going to emerge in the different countries to support the war effort. We see this in World War One, World War Two. National enthusiasm had played a big part in bringing the war. We talked about nationalism, and it's also necessary that it was going to help to sustain the enthusiasm once everyone knew that this wasn't going to be a short, decisive war. Propaganda was often effective in rallying morale. Posters tended to stress the need for service to the nation. Censorship, that was very important. Key right here, prevented anti-war feelings from gaining prominence. And conscientious objectors to the war faced persecution from the state and their fellow citizens. All right. So here's a British propaganda poster. All right. There's another U.S. propaganda poster. All right, to support the war effort by buying war bonds or government bonds. All right. So the war increased the power of the state. Very important. All right. Taxes rose, communications were controlled, goods requisitioned, and men were conscripted. And so many people began to maintain the home front, which was very crucial in the development of the war. One thing you'll see at this war is that bombing brought the war home to civilians. And this was the first time that actually civilians were being attacked in the war. And it was, well, from that many nations, saw where civilians were being attacked. All right. There were many civilian casualties. All right. With economic hardships. So it touched everyone. All right. Naval blockades and the use of horses and manpower caused severe shortages of food and rationing. And by 1916, much of Germany was suffering from food shortages. In 1918, Britain was sort of struggling with resources, and they began to ration food and raw materials. All right, and they began to collectively take agricultural land under government control. All right. So one of the things that we will see, or that you do see, is war was deeply linked to the erosion of personal liberties and an increase in state power, because you're trying to support this war effort, so the state's sort of going to have to take control, which seems like a logical step, in that there aren't unlimited resources in the world or in any one given country. All right. So when we talk about, I mentioned before, conscientious objectors, and this was a name given in Britain to those who refused to join the armed forces because they had quote unquote moral objections to war. All right. See, like the Quakers, the philosophical and the religious groups, um, were often investigated. Um, they did recognize this right to object. All right, but it was very reluctant. All right. And there you have it, my friends. All right, the end of World War One. All right, next time we'll be talking about uh, the treaties that ended the war and sort of that the impact after the war. All right.